Trump has just floated reinstating the military draft. He put the words into the mouth of the last of his Secretaries of Defense, and that guy, Christopher Miller, who sat back and watched January 6th unfold nearly as much as Trump did. Miller, it was, who dressed the draft up as a national service requirement. But make no mistake about it, Trump has now floated the one thing that would unquestionably lose him the election in a landslide, and it is a military draft. It seems to be targeted at 18, 19, and 20-year-old American boys and girls, and maybe 17-year-olds as well. And it would start with a mandatory military aptitude test administered by the Pentagon in your local high school. And any kid who refused to take that test might be prevented from graduating. And any school that hesitated to go along with this would lose all federal funding. So Trump, breaking precedent and using the American army domestically to suppress protests and conceivably kill civilians he does not like, is not the bottom of the plan for the military dictatorship part of the Trump dictatorship. Those Army soldiers and Marines and whoever else firing on other Americans, many of them or most of them or maybe all of them would be draftees. And when the Washington Post reported this and the story got no traction and no pickup at all, and even though the paper reported Trump had not expressly endorsed the draft himself, within 6 hours, Trump posted an enraged, chaotic denial reading, quote, "In fact, I never even thought of that idea," which even for Trump is a disastrously transparent, non-denial denial. Of course, he never thought of that idea. When has Donald Trump ever thought anything about a military draft except about how to dodge it? Somebody else thought of that idea, and that somebody else is the former Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller. The burden of this trial balloon turned lead balloon, now lead balloon that may have made somebody else the early frontrunner for the first Secretary of Defense in a Trump dictatorship, that burden has fallen on this idiot Miller, the ex-soldier, defense contractor, and weapons fetishist who took over at the Pentagon after an enraged Trump fired Mark Esper in November 2020 because Esper clearly would not let Trump use the military to overthrow the civilian government and void the election. The Post interviewed Christopher Miller, and Miller said a national service requirement should be, quote, strongly considered. He described the concept as a common rite of passage, one that would create a sense of shared sacrifice among America's youth, unquote. Shared sacrifice. Right. Just like in Vietnam. The military draft, a national service requirement, a shared sacrifice of 50,000 Americans was the animating force behind all the protests of the 1960s. It was such a third rail that the president who ended it was Richard Nixon. And you can dress the draft up any way you want, but under a draft requirement, American citizens, almost always teenagers, almost always minorities or economically or educationally deprived teenagers, were forced against their will to go to Vietnam or somewhere else and kill or be killed. It reinforces the bonds of civility, Miller also told the Washington Post. Why wouldn't we give that a try? If we're going to prepare for a great power competition, it's helpful to have a baseline understanding of the pool of potential military service members and their specific aptitudes prior. We don't have a mechanism now in our society that leavens everyone and provides a common focus and a common vision. Let me translate this Madman Miller's euphemisms here. And how many goddamned madmen Miller does Trump have working for him anyway? A great power competition, as Christopher Miller said, is in fact some kind of war or near-war conflict with China. Potential military service members, as Miller put it, are your kids who would be forced to take that aptitude test. The mechanism to provide a common focus and a common vision, that would be the draft. Trump tried to run away from this picture of a future America as military state, but the draft plan is far enough along inside the fascist Republican Party that it is now chasing Trump. This is not some half-baked dream of an American SS about which Miller just offhandedly mused to the Washington Post. This entire national service structure is inside Project 2025, the Trump and Federalist Society blueprint. Project 2025 for converting this country into something more resembling Iran. And that part of Project 2025 that includes the mandatory military exam and an interim and immediate step of greater access to secondary schools for military recruiters, that thing in Project 2025, that essay, just happens to have been written by former Trump Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller. Oh, and before Trump got some understanding that any sign of him supporting a draft will instantly kill his campaign if handled correctly by the opposition, some of his sycophants had already endorsed it to the Post. Quote, I like the idea of national service, and I'm not talking about in wartime. That was said by Ohio idiot Senator J.D. Vance, who is furiously peddling to become the vice presidential nominee. If he had not sufficiently come out in favor of conscription and forcing American teenagers to kill or be killed against their will, Vance then said something stupid and even macabre. He told the Post he wants more Americans to put, quote, some skin in the game, unquote. Who knows if Vance, who appears ever more so to be an utterly moronic, deranged lunatic, who knows if Vance realizes that his use of the word skin there may not be some kind of metaphor. Trump's non-denial just does not hold up. This is his pliant ex-Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, whose chief of staff was Kash Patel. Miller, who wrote up the plan for Project 2025, which Trump has sworn to implement, which includes a military draft that Senator Vance just endorsed. And if you're still not seeing this for what it is, the Post found disturbing enthusiasm from another man who was not only Trump's former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs, but who was also in George W. Bush's administration, so he's one deal with the devil shy of the elusive evil hat trick. His name, impossibly, is Rob Hood. And if the nightmare that opens up before us, mandatory military proficiency tests for high school girls, roundups of defiant school administrators and students, a draft, if those parts of the nightmare were not horrifying enough, Hood was willing to say the even quieter part out loud, even louder, that our young people are losers and takers, and if they won't shape up, they need to be shaped up by a draft. 18 to 20-year-olds would benefit from gaining, Hood told the paper, quote, a better appreciation for how great this country is. Who gave them their Social Security numbers? The United States government. There can be the takers and there can be the givers. And once we're all a bunch of takers and there are no givers, this country will collapse, unquote. Rob Hood. He's not a taker. The only thing he would take is your child's life. One more part of the Post's story merits quotation. The paper is paraphrasing the man who Trump might now disappear after this public relations disaster. Quote, a national service requirement, Christopher Miller contends, would afford young people from across the country the opportunity to learn about and rely on one another. He and other advocates on the political right say they believe the United States is losing its civil cohesion and view this as a solution. In other words, force all of the teenagers into camps and give them guns and teach them about our enemies. And as Trump said on television just this month, just this time, quote, the enemy from within, they are doing damage to this country. Under Trump, the military would not be there to defend our allies. It would not be there just in the event of conflict. It would be mandatory, it would be fascistic, it would be used domestically, and it would be aimed at Trump's political opponents, his enemies. I never even thought of that idea, he belches. He didn't have to. Every dictator in history has already thought of that idea for him. And by the way, I am not exaggerating, I don't think, about the impact this Washington Post story and just that gateway drug in it, the initial plan to make a military assessment of each high school kid in the United States mandatory. Just that, the impact just that would have on Trump's campaign if only it were to be handled correctly by Biden's campaign. Trump wants to reinstate the draft. The draft. There were revolutionaries blowing up buildings in this country because of the draft. The 1968 Democratic Convention and most of its campaign was sabotaged because of the draft. The Lyndon Johnson presidency and the Great Society and the strides towards integration died because of the draft. 100,000 young men fled this country because of the draft. No protest movement in the half a century since has carried the weight of, nor had the impact of, those of the 60s and early 70s because, simply, the draft was not a vague concept. The draft was literally life and death. Your life and death. My life and death. Is there a more powerful campaign message conceivable than Trump wants to draft your kids? Or Trump wants to force your kids to kill or be killed? Actually, there is. Because the voting age is not what it was in the 1960s. The 18-year-olds vote now. So there is a more powerful campaign message, and it is this: Trump wants to draft you. Trump wants to force you to kill or be killed. Trump's legal status news remains in stasis. I will note that his former campaign staffer, Jessica Denson, who broke the grip of Trump's non-disclosure agreements and now hosts the Lights On podcast, noted two side effects to his probation interview Monday, which have not only been criminally undercovered, but which could theoretically put Trump at further criminal risk. It is widely reported, and Trump did not whinily deny this, that at the end of the Zoom session, he told the probation people in New York, quote, be safe. As a former Trump worker and courtroom opponent, she knows what the rest of us can only suspect here. Trump telling New York State Corrections employees to be safe, that's a threat. And even if the word threat is a little too strong, At minimum, that's yet another stochastic warning. Be safe? Not be well, be good, be happy, be healthy, but be safe? Be safe from what? Safe. Safe from Trump's mobs. What else? More tangibly, Ms. Denson notes that in his probation interview, Trump confirmed he is in possession of his firearm at his home in Florida. Felons are not permitted to possess firearms in Florida, but he has now for 13 days, longer than Hunter Biden possessed one. Separately, it now proves at least 2 state organizations forbid nominating felons for political office. Article 16 of the Nevada Republican State Party bylaws insists that organization, quote, shall neither recognize nor support any candidate for public office who has been convicted of a felony or while serving in a public office was impeached and convicted or removed from office for any reason. Well, close on the last one there. Got him on the first. Of course, there are Republicans there in the Republican Party of Nevada, so there is another article permitting them to behave immorally and override Article 16 by a 2/3 vote. Unresolved, however, is the matter of Trump and Washington state. Denny Westneat of the Seattle Times notes that since 1865, Washington, before it was a state, has had a law barring felons from holding elected office. It was updated in 2016 to read that any registered voter can challenge the right of any candidate to be on the general election ballot in Washington state for any one of 5 reasons, including those candidates who were, quoting, convicted of a felony by a court of competent jurisdiction, the conviction not having been reversed, nor the person's civil rights restored after the conviction. Columnist Westneat quotes an attorney named David Vogel in Washington state who says, I have clients lined up who are going to be all over pursuing a ballot challenge in Trump's case. Mr. Westneat notes plenty of presidential candidates have been thrown off Washington state ballots in the past, always from minor parties. And also on the legal front, for reasons I can only shake my head at, and I'm beginning to think there may be a masochism requirement if you want to be both a prosecutor and a Democrat, the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and prosecutor Matthew Colangelo have agreed to voluntarily testify to Jim Jordan's latest dog and pony show, which Jordan, for some reason, calls the House Judiciary Committee. Bragg and Colangelo will appear on Friday, July 12th. And if you're saying, wait, July 12th? July 12th, why does that date ring a bell? It's because Thursday, July 11th, is still the date scheduled for Trump's sentencing. Happily, it's not like they'll actually be sending Trump to jail just one day before Bragg and Colangelo go and testify to the Jordan Star Chamber. Sending him to jail for illegal possession of a gun while a felon, or threatening the jury, or violating the gag order a dozen times, or committing the 34 crimes he was convicted of. I know he's not going to jail. Jonathan Turley told me so.
It also would be absurd to send him to jail. He is an elderly first offender, nonviolent crime.
He is an elderly first offender. He is an elderly first offender. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, Nancy. I'm an elderly first offender. I've been found guilty. The stormy jury, it had no doubts. I'm far too old to go to prison, but Turley says I'm fine for the White House. Thank you, Nancy Faust. And thank you, Soggy Bottom Boys, elderly first offender all through his days. Also of interest here, Jonathan Martin is back, the Politico, quote, reporter, unquote, who has spent the last year talking about almost nothing except President Biden's age, returns to complain that nobody is talking about President Biden's age. And he's doing this because Hunter Biden's conviction means the president is even older than and should drop out. Honestly, I don't know what Jonathan Martin is talking about, except that while he was talking about it, he also managed to invoke Aaron Sorkin. So for all I know, he may be reporting that Sorkin may have just borrowed something else from my life to make into a third TV series. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown, so there's a story in the TV sports world that Stephen A. Smith is about to sign another deal with ESPN, and that the key bargaining point, reportedly, is that he believes he must be paid more than ESPN pays that challenged guy it has on its air, Pat McAfee. And this made me laugh and flash back to 1997, this time of year, when there were more people watching ESPN studio shows than there are now. And I was the lead anchor of SportsCenter, and they were paying me a little less than $300,000 a year. And I figured out the show was profiting like $60 million a year. And the rule of thumb in TV was 10% goes to the talent, 10% of the profit. That meant they should be paying me and Dan $3 million each. And I told this to one executive, and then he looked like he was going to have a stroke. And now Smith wants $20 million for an audience that's only half as profitable as it was in 1997. Which means I need to tell you the saga of how I quit SportsCenter 27 years ago and left for NBC, and then ESPN tried to rehire me. Coming up. But first, as ever, there are still more new idiots to talk about. The daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who we celebrate as today's worst persons in the world. However, the bronze, worse, and I mean this affectionately, a Twitter Xer self-identifying only as a follower of mine named Art Martin. Art responded to a Nate Silver tweet, and he has struck me right in my guilt. Nate Silver's tweet began, "If I told you 10 years ago," and it ended with, "Would you be surprised?" Mr. Martin replied to Nate Silver with, quote, "If I had told you 10 years ago that Nate Silver would turn into someone as, quote, credible, unquote, as Chris Cillizza, would you be surprised?" Oh, as the kids say, man, do I feel seen. And not in a good way. Nate Silver and Chris Cillizza in the same tweet, two of my biggest guilts in my life. I'm sorry. I thought they added something. I didn't realize that what they added would always have to be limited to single-digit numbers. I'm sorry. Couldn't have worked in Tur or Jonathan Turley in there, or like Aaron Sorkin. The runner-up, worser, Jonathan Martin of Politico. We've met him here before. You may remember Jonathan Martin from such worst person entries as, "I had important Trump news, but I sat on it until I got a book deal," and "I spent 18 months calling Trump the frontrunner, then the polls changed, so I wrote an article saying Trump's the frontrunner, not so fast." And most relevantly, Biden should stop calling David Axelrod a prick and admit he's too old. Now Jonathan Martin is back to the only topic he can handle, Biden's age. And he's back with the kind of brilliant take that will make America ring if this is 1999. And it invokes Aaron Sorkin. Quote, "In the Sorkin version of 2024, Hunter's conviction would be the escape hatch Biden takes to focus on family and drop out of the race, deferring to a Democrat who is not approaching 82. Here, in reality, it will take the jaws of life to get Biden out, and Dems will continue what they've done for 2 years, grumbling but saying nothing in public." Okay, first off, in the 2024 Sorkin version of 2024, Aaron Sorkin would not write this scene unless somebody else wrote it for him first. Then it would mysteriously appear in his script. Also, Mr. Martin writes, Dems will continue what they've done for 2 years, grumbling but saying nothing in public. Why, yes, Danny Concannon's summer vacation relief guy. Not one Democrat has said anything in public about Joe Biden's age these last 2 years. Not one. Why are American news organizations imploding? The unrecognizable, ever-changing marketplace? Yes. The collapse of the media industry as a business? Absolutely. That the Washington Post had 10 people cover the Hunter Biden trial and all of its tweets about the guilty verdict combined in the first 5 hours had gotten only 60 retweets because the Post doesn't understand that its audience doesn't give a crap. And the audience that did give a crap would never read the Post's coverage of that story? You betcha. But there's a fourth factor about which we will continue to do what we've done for 2 years, grumbling but saying nothing in public, I guess. The quality of today's political journalists is so mediocre that there was actually a bidding war for this one-note idiot, Jonathan Martin. But our winner, Royce White, I love this guy, the ex-NBA player whose principal campaign issues are his own rage and his own NBA career. His NBA career, which lasted exactly 8 minutes and 55 seconds. White was the Republican who lost to Ilhan Omar 75-25. He is now poised to be the Republican nominee for the Senate in Minnesota to try to unseat Amy Klobuchar. As the Daily Beast has extensively reported, Mr. 8 minutes and 55 seconds has had a campaign ethics complaint filed on him after it turned out some of his campaign money was spent at a strip club. And here come the G-strings, an all-nude strip club in Florida, not Minnesota. A strip club called the Gold Rush Cabaret. Would-be Republican Senator White went on David Pakman's show, where the following exchange took place. Pakman, your claim is there were filings which said you spent campaign funds at a strip club, but they were incorrect filings? White, no, they didn't say I spent the funds at a strip club, or let's say they didn't say I spent the funds on strippers. Pakman, but it was spent at a strip club? White, well, they sell food at the strip club, don't they? Yes, food. You spent the money at the strip club on food. The Gold Rush Cabaret. Well, maybe the campaign was prospecting. Later in the same interview, White, who had already said they didn't say I spent the funds on strippers, implied that it may have been somebody else in his campaign who spent the money at the Gold Rush Cabaret. Not him, even though he just said it was him. And it was spent on fine dining. Royce, I spent it on food at the strip club. White. I never heard that described as food before. I love this guy. He's his own series. And he's today's worst person in the world. I'll have a taco salad. There is a huge oral history of ESPN from 2011 by Jim Miller, and most of it is pretty good, but there's one line in it that triggered this recollection. The executive vice president of the company in 1997 was named Howard Katz, and in this ESPN book, he was quoted as saying, I didn't fire Keith, I just chose not to renew his contract. And then there's a couple of quotes from guys I never heard of who said, no, we fired him. None of it's true. Howard and I got along surprisingly well at ESPN, and even better since, so I'm just going to assume he misremembered all of this. And he's right. I mean, legally, he He chose not to renew my contract early in 1997, and a couple of weeks later, instead, he offered me a new 4-year contract, which would have basically doubled my salary. And even after I had said no thanks and I signed with NBC, the then president of ABC, Bob Iger, whatever happened to him, tried to get me to back out of the NBC deal, to renege on it, and then sign a new deal at ESPN. So they offered me 2 new deals after they didn't renew my old contract. See how this works? In 96 and 97, it was no secret that my first choice was to leave ESPN. I had come within hours of asking to be let out of my deal in the summer of 1996. A radio station in Chicago, WMVP, had wanted me to go do the afternoon drive show there, a mix of news and sports, and they were offering me twice the money I was getting to host SportsCenter. And I was ready to go. Loved it, had a great week there. They wined me, they dined me, and everybody offered me a free beer. Welcome to Chicago. You're from out of town? And then ownership of the radio station simply pulled the plug on the station. It was in 31st place and said they could save a lot more money by simply rebroadcasting what was on FM radio. And eventually, and this would have been interesting had I gone to Chicago, eventually the owners sold WMVP to ESPN. Anyway, my ESPN deal was set to expire on December 31st, 1997, but they had the option to extend it for, I can't remember, either for a year after that or 2 years, but they had to notify me really early in 97. And instead, on February 18, 1997, Howard Katz proposed to my then agent that we tear up the contract and do a new 4-year deal that started at $700,000 a year and covered a radio show with Dan Patrick and the Sunday edition of SportsCenter and the ESPY Awards ceremonies and the internet and everything else. This was a lot of money for ESPN in 1997, $700,000 a year. So we played around with that for a while. But I didn't really want to go into radio full-time, not then, when I still had dark hair. So on April 4th, 1997, Howard Katz came back with another offer, 3 sports centers a week, plus some radio, starting at $550,000 a year. I noticed that this was less than the first offer. So 2 weeks later, at the first ever Jackie Robinson night at Shea Stadium in New York, Howard came up to me and asked me in front of everybody in our booth, ranging from Chris Berman to Robin Roberts to all the producers and briefly to President Bill Clinton. He asked me if we were close on this new deal that he'd offered me. I got angry at him. He got angry at me for getting angry at him. And I said, forget it. And what's more, it makes no sense for me to hang around here as a lame duck, Howard. Wait, Howard the Duck? And he calmed down. He said I could look at other jobs and we'd let things cool off and talk again about a new deal in a few weeks after I looked around to see if there was something I'd rather do than be at ESPN. And if it still wasn't going anywhere, we would agree on a date early in the summer and I could leave 6 months before the contract officially ended. And then 3 huge things happened about this that most people still don't know to this day. Even after all that, when I called Phil Mushnick of the New York Post and Richard Sandomir of the New York Times, and I told them I would be leaving ESPN, and it appeared I would be going to go to Court TV to be the host and executive producer of my own sports show 4 nights a week, I almost stayed at ESPN. Once it got out that I was leaving, I got a letter from a viewer who told me that his son, who had autism, had been at his other son's Little League game. And when his brother banged out a base hit, this kid, who had rarely ever spoken in his life, suddenly shouted out one of my catchphrases. This guy said he hit the ball real hard. Then there was a fly ball, and the boy said, it's deep and I don't think it's playable. Then they went home, and this virtually non-communicative child began to draw illustrations of my catchphrases. For whatever reason, I had triggered some kind of blossoming by this child, and his brother and his father sent me a book of the child's illustrations of my catchphrases. I am not trying to suggest I really had anything to do with this. It was good fortune and circumstance, and probably something to do with the tone of my voice, nothing more. But I was very moved by this, and I remain so. and by other things. People wrote to me or wrote in the press about how much the show Dan and I did meant to them. And I went back to Howard Katz and I said, look, I know I've been impossible. You have to understand that from my perspective, the company has also been impossible. But Dan and I created too good a show to let it die. When I go here to Court TV, I'm only going to work Monday through Thursday on this new thing. If you will send a car to take me to and from Bristol every Sunday and give me some token salary, give me $50,000 or something, I'll just do the Sunday night show for you every week. You'll never see me. I'll never see you. It's the show that has the highest factor of management control. It's basically coloring in by numbers. And it reruns all morning on Monday, so 40% of the people who see Dan and I during the week, they see this one show. That's it. If you want some other stuff for me to do, like radio commentaries, great, we can negotiate that. But we should not let this die. At least let's have it on once a week. And Howard Katz said, okay, let me think about this. It sounds really good. And he got back to me the next day and he said it was the most difficult decision he had ever made in this business. But he just couldn't do it. It established too much of a precedent, especially the idea that somebody could work at ESPN and also at some other TV operation. He put it very bluntly. If ESPN was not the sole employer of its people, it could not control them by threatening to fire them. And he looked at me and he said, especially you. And in the same sentence, he said, look, we'd love to continue the relationship, though. We see lots of ways you could fit into ESPN Classic, like once a week or once a month or whatever, and we'd like to get in on the bidding for these radio commentaries that you're going to do on the side. Well, it all ended surprisingly amicably. I decided to go to MSNBC and NBC Sports instead of Court TV. And as I signed the contract, I called the ESPN president, Steve Bornstein, and the head of SportsCenter, John Walsh. I called them from the office of the head of NBC Sports, Dick Ebersol. And in my diary, I can't tell if that was June 19th, 1997 or June 20th, 1997, but I made the calls, and it was Ebersol's idea. Call them now. Call them right now. It'll matter later. The funniest thing was, the following Monday, June 23rd, I was packing up my stuff in my house in Connecticut. I am all set, and I am officially beginning my first week not working for ESPN and instead working for NBC, and the phone rings, and it's John Walsh in Los Angeles for something, and he has to talk to my agent immediately. Do you know where she is right now? Howard Katz and I have just spoken with Bob Iger, and he wants to present a primetime proposal to you for ABC and till you can continue at ESPN. And I laughed and I said, John, I signed with NBC last week. The World Series and the news show and Super Bowl stuff. Remember, I called you from Dick Ebersol's office. Do you remember? It was Friday or Thursday, whatever it was. We're having the news conference today. And he is dead serious. And he says to me, oh. And there's a long pause. Well, I still need to talk to your agent. Well, I had known Bob Iger, who had apparently precipitated this phone call, since I was in college. In 1979, he had given me an hour of his time just for career advice because I had interned at the TV station for which his first wife had been a news producer, Channel 5 in New York. I told that story, I think, 2 weeks ago. And Bob was wonderful to me. So I called Bob and I explained what had happened, and he said, Steve Bornstein only told me that you were leaving this morning. I'm very, very sorry. I knew there were contentious negotiations about a new deal for you, but I had no clue it was at the point where you might actually leave. I should have known. That's my fault. That's why I told John to make the call he did. Trust me, if I had known, it would have been totally different. I would have made it right by you. You would have wanted to stay. And if it doesn't work at NBC, you call me directly and I'll bring you back here myself. I mean, the ending was so unexpectedly and surprisingly pleasant that even when my new bosses at MSNBC suddenly announced, I think it was in Newsweek, that they were going to call my program The Big Show, which was our nickname for SportsCenter at ESPN, The Big Show, but they hadn't told anybody at ESPN that we were going to call our MSNBC show The Big Show. It was me who got on the phone with Howard Katz and a couple of other people at ESPN to apologize and to make sure they were okay with it. So even after my ESPN career was officially over and all chance of my returning was dead, we tried to revive it, both of us, Howard Katz and me, in good faith. And I don't think Bob Iger was blowing smoke at me. He had no reason to. And even after all that, the parting was non-nuclear. I think they sent me a fruit basket for my first night at MSNBC on October 1st. And then it all blew up. John Walsh called the TV sports columnist at USA Today, Rudy Martzke, and gave him my first set of ratings from MSNBC just to try to make me look like I couldn't succeed without ESPN. Martzke told me that. Direct quote, "They want to punish you publicly. Walsh has been pressuring me to run the very poor ratings, and he said, I'm going to finally do it. I just wanted to give you a little warning, and maybe you have a comment." Well, that set the tone for the next 5 years of warfare, and it was nuclear pretty quickly. But this impression that ESPN chose to dismiss me or not renew me or not bring me back, it's nonsense. Howard did not renew me. Instead, he offered to double my salary if I stayed. If I had signed with NBC, Iger was still trying to get me to back out after I had signed with NBC and stay at ESPN and ABC. The irony of this minor detail from about 1997, printed in 2011, I think, is that I had already returned to ESPN by the time it was printed. I took an hour out of my day at MSNBC to go on with Dan Patrick on his ESPN radio show from 2005 through 2007. A year after that book came out with that quote in it, 2012, I was talking to the executives at ESPN about going back full-time. And a year later I did, to launch a nightly show on ESPN2. And that ended when they laid off like $100 million worth of talent salaries in 2015. But then I went back again in 2018. And I did SportsCenter, and I did baseball games on radio and on TV, and I did reports, and I did commentaries. I did the not top 10 plays of the week, and on and on and on. And finally, we parted happily in the late summer of 2020 so I could return to political coverage. And I knew they wouldn't want that, and I didn't want to put it on ESPN. And the unlikely result of that, my parting happily in 2020, on the books at Disney, I am listed as a Disney and ESPN retiree. I get benefits. I retired from ESPN. I mean, they didn't give me a gold watch or anything, but I'm technically a retiree. And if you had predicted that in 1997 or 2011, well, you know the cliche. I bring all this up again because I don't know how often I have thought of that father and his two boys and the one who started speaking but only in my catchphrases. I would guess it's at least once a month. Those boys would have to be in their 30s by now, or nearly. And I wonder often of what has become of them. And I sure hope they are well. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, were arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2. It was written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc., and our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever, who, of course, accompanied me on the Trump elderly song. Our announcer was my friend Jonathan Banks from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and Airplane. Everything else was pretty much my fault, as usual. That's Countdown for this, the 147th day until the 2024 presidential election, and the 1,254th day since convicted felon and first-time elderly offender Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the July 11th sentencing hearing, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if it happens, use the not regularly given elector objection option to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till the next one, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck. first offender. I've been found guilty. The stormy jury had no doubts. I'm far too old to go to prison, but Turley says I'm fine for the White House.
The end.